Okay, what are we doing today?
Pick the Haro. Pick the Haro.
What? Who said
Over here, the blue one.
build the Haro?
If you don't pick me, I'll curse you.
Jeez, oh, yeah. Okay, no. We'll build the Haru, just don't...
Yay.
Ugh.
I mean, yay.
So I don't know if it's Haru or Haro, but Haru Control Blue. I was challenged to paint one of these little ball guys a long time ago by several people. Several of my online friends have done them, and I want to do one as well. I've seen them on the shelves a lot of the times in display cases at some of the LGSs in the area. For those who don't know, LGS stands for Local Game Store. This is a kit by Bandai. It claims that you don't need tools, and it claims that you don't need glue, and I will confirm that this kit goes together so smoothly you do not need glue. However, personally, I do recommend you having at least some hobby nippers and maybe a filing stick or something just to get some pieces extra smooth. Now, starting in with this, we will be doing some painting, but I'm going to try to keep things as close to the original color as possible, and I'm just going to kind of talk through my choices and why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I really wanted this guy to feel old, like he's really well used, he's worn down a bit, but he's not broken, he's not useless, he's not abandoned. Now, we're going to be taking advantage of the fact that I have a bad habit of not cleaning my airbrush as thoroughly as I should, and I know that in its current state, although it could use a bit of cleaning, it will spritz the paint if I put it through too thin, meaning if I add too much thinner. Why do I want it to spritz and spit the paint out? Well, one of the best ways to add depth to something like this, especially a ball, which is essentially a smooth surface, is to add texture. So by putting on 2 or 3 thin coats of a spritzed-like texture and then putting a smooth texture on top of it, it kind of gives this appearance of maybe either the paint starting to wear down and go thin, or as though he's maybe been patched up with a paint coat over the original paint, and then we put some scratches and other details like that in. A really awesome way of replicating this is by using dry brushing and stippling. If you don't have an airbrush, just go really light and mild, and in some places you may want to dab away with a paper towel and then reapply and just try to build up some texture. So here I'm just using contrast paint. I'm using ultramarine blue. This is going to get us a lot closer to the original blue color of the model. So the reason we're wanting to go back there again is I want this to feel like a well-used version of exactly what it is on the box. I'm not trying to turn this into something it's not. My understanding, these colors are chosen for a very specific reason, and I don't want to be altering the color dramatically like I am with the bright blue. So by putting this translucent blue on top, I'm maintaining the dark blue color while still having all that texture of the speckling that we have with the light blue. Now, if you're doing this by hand, this is going to be a little tricky, but essentially you want to make a glaze out of a darker blue and lightly apply that across the entire model. If you are struggling with that and you don't like the way that it turns out, I recommend just doing a very, very light dry brush of a dark blue all over and just keep building that color up until it kind of gets back in the ballpark of what you want for your model. So here I'm using a dark purple contrast paint, and I could have used a black wash instead, but I felt that I just wasn't going to use this color otherwise, and with it already being a purple piece, I felt it was a good place to use it. What this is doing is it's essentially building up a lot of depth in what would otherwise be a very flat area inside of both the arm and leg sockets of the model. I'm going to be adding a few more colors later on down the road, but this was a good start to weathering. So we want to go ahead and lay in this dark purple, and then I'm going to be using a Q-tip with some rubbing alcohol a little later to wipe it down and remove most of it and leave what's in the excess. This is going to stain the surface of the plastic a little bit, and that's okay. That's going to help with the weathering effect. So while we let all those purple pieces dry, we're just going to go ahead and get started on this inner shell. Now, I do add a bit of details even though I don't really plan to open mine back up again. It is meant so that you can pull that face cover off and display it without the whole model coming apart. So if you intend to display it in that way, or if you intend to use it in any other kind of way, then you might want to go ahead and paint this. I'm just doing an all over dry brush of a silver, and then I go back in with some coppers and golds and things like that and pick out a few detail spots. So let's take a second to talk about the Haro control units and the fact that their colors seem to be very specific. The fact that certain colors represent different things within the universe of Gundam, but also the fact that there is like next to no information out there if you Google it. There seems to be random references stating that different Harus are based on different characters from various different Gundam anime series or different universes, but there's no conclusive evidence claiming that X equals Y. I actually really wanted to do a whole series on the different Harus and the information that I found about them, where originally this video was going to be half and half, but I legitimately cannot find conclusive information. I can only find contradictory information where things are directly contradicting other things that I have found. Even the wiki doesn't seem to have any conclusive evidence as to what exactly the Harus are or where they come from. My first experience with the Harus inside of the Gundam universe was the video game series, and they kind of are used as save icons and things like that. But other than that, I personally don't have any experience with them inside of Gundam. So if anyone has more insight on the Harus and what they are and what their purpose is inside of the Gundam universe, please leave that in the comments below, because I am very interested in learning more information about them, but there is just so little on the wiki. So now that those purple pieces have dried, I'm just taking a Q-tip with some rubbing alcohol, and I'm basically removing anything from the flat surfaces. This is going to leave a lot of that purple staining down in those recesses as well as around some of those raised pieces. It's also going to allow for a little bit of staining on some of those purple pieces as well, and it'll help to kind of give an almost oil washed or oil stained appearance. So although I haven't kept up with a lot of the different Gundam shows, the ones that I have seen are set in kind of a dystopian future. And I really love that aesthetic where it's almost borderline diesel punk, where at times it's very elegant, very clean, it's very formal, and then at other times it's downright dirty. You're in the grit of the war, or just the grit and grime of the engine as these Gundams are getting repaired and cleaned up. So in my mind, the Harus are kind of a cross between that very clean feeling and the gritty and grimy feeling. So a Haru that is probably being used often would be super gritty, super grimy, but it would also be well taken care of and well loved. So anything on the outside is going to be cleaned and polished, even if the paint is wearing down, which is why you'll see that I have a relatively clean outside on my Haru, whereas inside of the arms is this greasy, grimy feel. Now, speaking of greasy and grimy, I do want the inside to feel just as weathered in case I ever decide that I want to remove that front cover. Now, two great ways of doing this is with panel line. So I'm using both a brown panel line and a black panel line, and then I'm going back in and cleaning up a few areas. I re-dry brush in silver, and I also do a little bit of touch up with the copper and gold. Now, if you didn't have panel line, that's fine. You don't have to use it for that last step, and you don't necessarily have to use it for this step either. You can mimic it with a black wash, but I'm just going through in anywhere where there's a dark recess or crevice or a line, I'm going ahead and adding this black panel line into it. So you'll see here I do it on all the fingers. I use it to accent the line that kind of makes the mouth on the Haru robot. So like I said before, I want this to feel kind of grimy, so I'm going in with a brown panel wash now, and I'm doing the same thing as we did before. I'm putting it on a little thick, I'm letting it dry, and then I'm coming back in with a Q-tip and wiping off the bulk of it, leaving it in the recesses and leaving around all those raised details. Okay, now, I cannot stress this enough. One of the things you got to keep in mind when you start to do this next step, this next weathering step, it's very crucial to keep this in mind that no matter where you're adding your weathering on where pieces are opening and closing, you need to also add weathering to the other parts that it interacts with. So if you have a hatch door that closes up against something and you weather the hatch door but you don't weather the actual part that it's closing up against, that looks really, really bad. So you really need to keep that in mind when doing this next step, regardless of what model you're doing it on. Because putting weathering on one thing that moves and interacts with an object, but not the object it interacts with, is a really bad habit. And I've seen it on a lot of professional models where if you go to a convention, you'll see models where a hatch door has weathering, but the hatch itself doesn't have weathering. And it just doesn't look right. Now, I by no means am any kind of professional, but I've always done it this way, and I've never had anyone who I've done a commission for complain. So we're just going to do a very mild dry brush around the outside edge of the hatch, and in a few places go a little heavier, and then add a little speckle here and there, maybe in the middle of the panel. Don't do that on all of them, less is more. Anywhere we've gone a little too heavy, we're going to use that later to add a brighter silver to add a more recent damaged effect, meaning a fresher scratch. And then again, you want to weather the same locations on the other pieces of the model to ensure that when everything comes together, all of our moving parts look like they actually belong together. So I've let everything dry for a little bit, and we're going back in, and in places where I was a little ham-fisted, we're just adding in some more scrapes and dings using a silver paint. We're using Metal Color by Vallejo. Whatever brighter metal color that you have, I would recommend using that here. Again, remembering less is more, so in a few places we're just following it like an edge highlight, and then in other places we're just adding in a little extra something and we're connecting some of our pieces together. Keep in mind that we want to make sure that the patterns are as random as we can. Little nicks and scratches here, little dings there, drag the brush across here and there. We really don't want a pattern. Now, the only place where I purposely went in and put patterns was when I was working on the face, and that was because I wanted 2 scratches above the eyes to kind of almost act like eyebrows to give him a bit more emotion. I also added a little bit of a scratch just below the eyes to that line that cuts across the chest to kind of act more like a smile. Now, I personally have never been a big fan of the hands and legs that come with the Haro unit. I find them more adorable when they are just in their ball form. So although I am going to paint the legs in case I ever want to put them all the way together, I really have no intention on having them on the model. But that having been said, there is a really convenient way to store all the spare parts both inside the model as well as on the bottom side of the base, so you don't lose the parts when displaying the model in its ball form. Personally, I wasn't too happy with how dull the eyes were going to end up on this model. To me, it looked as though they had been turned off. I imagine that the Haru's eyes are probably some kind of LED bulb or LED panel so that it could give off different emotions. And so as a result of that, it would be quite a bright light. So in order to replicate that, we're going to be using a silver base tone on its eyes, and then you could use whatever color you want. I'm going to be replicating its original color, which is red, and for that I'm going to be using a paint called Tamiya Clear Red. However, you could use any clear or semi-translucent color that you have available to you and paint these in whatever color you want, but by putting that silver in behind that translucent color, it really helps them to pop and makes the color significantly more vibrant. All that was left to do was to put the whole thing together, and I ended up putting a mild dry brush on its base, and I'm really happy with how the whole thing turned out. Maybe next time in the future we'll do some experiments with cutting into the surface of the ball itself to add a bit more depth and to actually put some real three-dimensional scratches on there, maybe even throw in some green stuff work. I think on the next one I'm going to actually do it up as part of a diorama to make it look as though it's abandoned, and maybe it's started to rust out a bit, and actually seriously cut into the model and go really heavy with the rust pigments and the effects and just have a lot of fun with it. But for now, this was a great introduction to this little model kit, and it didn't take that long to put together. In any case, I had a lot of fun working on today's model kit, and I hope that you guys learned some things along the way, and at the very least you enjoyed getting to see my experience with the Haro model kit. I hope you guys really enjoyed today's video. I know I had a lot of fun working on it, and even if you didn't follow along, I hope that you guys at least learned something that you can take away to work on some of your other model kits. But I've rambled on long enough, and this video's gone on long enough. So as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for all the love and support. And until next time, I hope your display case is always overfilled and your pile of shame never runs empty.